Nations General Assembly that has this year as a main topic to discuss the future we want, the United Nations we need. This year, however, for the first time in UN's history, world leaders will not be traveling to New York due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the debate will be held virtually. UN's top representatives announced that over 170 heads of state and government will take part in the debate, where they will discuss global responses to the world's most pressing challenges, including the coronavirus pandemic, climate change, inequality, protected conflicts, extreme poverty, and hunger. This Thursday, the Chinese President Xi Jinping said during his intervention at the 75th General Debate of the United Nations General Assembly that China will continue to work together with other countries in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. The Chinese president also warned of the importance of a green revolution for a better future for all.
China is actively involved in the international fight against COVID-19, contributing its share to upholding global public health security. Going forward, we will continue to share our epidemic control practices as well as diagnostics and therapeutics with other countries, provide support and assistance to countries in need, ensure stable global anti-epidemic supply chains, and actively participate in the global research on tracing the source and transmission routes of the virus. COVID-19 will not be the last crisis to confront humanity, so we must join hands and be prepared to meet even more global challenges. COVID-19 reminds us that humankind should launch a green revolution and move faster to create a green way of development and life, preserve the environment, and make Mother Earth a better place for all. Humankind can no longer afford to ignore the repeated warnings of nature and go down the beaten path of extracting resources without investing in conservation, pursuing development at the expense of protection, and exploiting resources without restoration.
At the 75th General Debate of the United Nations General Assembly, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan called for a reform of the multilateral organizations, in particular the United Nations itself.
There is the need of a reform for multilateral organizations, in particular the United Nations. We have seen how ineffective the existing global mechanisms have been during this crisis. This was so much true that it took weeks, even months, for the Security Council, the most fundamental decision-making body, years from this rostrum. The fate of humanity cannot be left at the mercy of a limited number of countries. In order to prevent the loss of reputation of international organizations, we must first review our mentality, institutions, and rules. Effective multilateralism requires effective multilateral institutions.
Guatemala's Ministry of Culture and Sports is currently reviewing the security protocols for the reopening of sports centers and archaeological sites in the country after over 6 months of inactivity due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The proposal includes the physical distancing and signaling of the different places for the visitors to stand, as well as follow-up guide in the face of the novel coronavirus, according to an official press release. Everything is ready for the Ministry of Public Health and Social Assistance in conjunction with the Presidential Commission for Emergency Care COVID to give their approval to document details. As planned, the most visited archaeological parks will begin to gradually operate and with enough space to avoid crowds. On Monday, at least 11 people were injured and 13 others were detained after Colombia's security forces repressed the national strike that took place against police brutality. The protest concentrated in Bogota, where the National Police Mobile Anti-Riot Squad injured several young people after throwing a stun bomb. Videos posted on social networks showed how the agents also used tear gas to dissipate the peaceful demonstrations. Arbitrary arrests were made during the demonstrations, called in rejection of the systematic massacres and murders of young people, social leaders, and former guerrilla fighters. Thousands of people also took to the streets to repudiate President Ivan Duque's neoliberal policies and demand social protection, security, work, health, and education. For the last 15 days, the country has faced a wave of protests that were unleashed after Javier Ordóñez's murder in hands of two police agents. On Monday, the officers were sent to prison for the crimes of torture and murder. In the framework of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Brazil's Agora of the Earth Inhabitants in the Humanist Movement launched a campaign for the universalization of the right of a COVID-19 vaccine. From Sao Paulo, our team brings us more details in the following report.
Pharmaceutical corporations are already pre-selling COVID-19 vaccine batches to the world's richest countries, even though they are home to only 13%.
But that is also a public expense, although people may get them at a lower cost when they ever get them.
Speculation on the fate of vaccines runs against the orders of the World Health Organization. The proportion of people who need to be immunized against the pathogen for the total population to be protected is 65% to 70%. Pharmaceutical companies seem to ignore the recommendations.
Science product better living conditions, but there is no neutrality. There are not just philanthropic people thinking about the good of humanity. Every announcement that the vaccine will be available in October, in January, in December means that the stock market value is exploding.
The Brazilian government has already indicated that not everyone will get a vaccine.
If they do not get the vaccine, no one can force anyone to be vaccinated.
The Agora of the Earth Inhabitants movement linked with diverse nuclei working for a global citizenship for the common good, has launched a campaign for the universal right to health.
The United Nations should declare all on any vaccine against COVID-19 as a common good of humanity. Life is priceless. If life is priceless, it cannot be commercialized. A vaccine that will save us from a virus that is deadly and has caused a pandemic cannot be commercialized.
This initiative is opposed to the appropriation of scientific discoveries on living organisms by large pharmaceutical companies and the profit that the commercialization of medicines implies.
We need to fight with all of our strength against what the people call the virus of private interest.
More than half of the COVID-19 vaccine doses to be produced have already been purchased by the US, UK, European Union, Hong Kong, Macau, Japan, Switzerland, and Israel. The UN Assembly is marking 7.5 decades since it was founded with a focus on the pandemic and calling for an inclusive but also humane multilateralism.
And we'll be right back after this very short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. On Thursday, Beijing dismissed a U.S. accusation of a New York police officer spying for China as completely made up. The Chinese government also said that individual organizations who push to strip Beijing of the Winter Olympics are making a mistake because they politicize sports events like this one.
Individual organizations have linked human rights issues to the Beijing Winter Olympic Games. in an attempt to put pressure on China, which is a wrong act to politicize sports. This act violates the spirit of the Olympic Charter and is also an intervention and destruction of the development of the international human rights. The relevant U.S. accusations are completely made up. The so-called indictment is full of apparently, possibly, and other assumptions, and are completely trumped-up charges. The United States attempt to deliberately smear Chinese consular organizations and staff will not succeed.
The spokesperson further added that China will keep close communication and consultation with the Vatican on Bishop's appointment deal.
Over the past 2 years, since the signing of the interim agreement between China and the Vatican on the appointment of bishops, the agreement has been implemented smoothly with the joint efforts of both sides. The Catholic cause in China has developed heavily. The two sides will maintain close communications and consultation and continue to push forward the process of improving relations.
Bolivians living in France denounced a maneuver to hamper the vote of thousands of them living abroad in the general elections of the South American country, where the right wing of the de facto government is trying to legitimize its coup d'etat. In the declaration to which Cuban press agency Prensa Latina had access, they declared that more than 50,600 residents abroad were removed from the list for the elections of October 18th, in a new attempt to avoid the triumph of the movement towards socialism led by the presidential candidate Luis Arce and David Choquehuanca, his formula mate. Making the vote impossible represents an attack on fundamental rights and a violation of the Bolivian constitution, they warned. According to the residents, about 5% of them living abroad will be excluded from the elections, taking advantage of the context of the health crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Fortnight, daily hospital admissions in England have more than doubled. Tens of thousands of daily infections in October would, as night follows day, lead to hundreds of daily deaths in November, and those numbers would continue to grow unless we act.
Johnson also announced a package of new restrictions, including a requirement for pubs, restaurants and other venues in England to close between 10 p.m. and 5 p.m. People have to wear face coverings in taxis as well as public transport. The size of gatherings is being curbed, with weddings limited to 15 people instead of 30. A plan to bring spectators back to sports stadiums starting in October is being put on hold. The World Health Organization Director General Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said that the health organization is working to ensure equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines globally, believing it is to be the fastest road to ending the pandemic and accelerating global economic recovery. A wildfire is scorching its way through brush and timber from the mountains to the distant northeast of Los Angeles, is threatening more than 1,000 homes. California authorities say the Bobcat fire continues to threaten Mount Wilson, northeast of Los Angeles, and towns in the Antelope Valley of the other side of the San Gabriel Mountains. About 1,000 homes are under evacuation orders. Governor Gavin Newsom says nearly 19,000 firefighters are battling 27 major blazes around California. He says the fires have destroyed thousands of buildings and burned an area larger than the state of Connecticut. The Arctic's floating ice cover has shriveled in 2020 to the second smallest size since its records began 42 years ago, offering further stark evidence of the impact of global warming, according to the UN's World Meteorological Organization.
What we're also seeing is that it's not just the extent of the ice, it's the thickness, it's the volume. And so what used to be thick multi-year ice, which would stay around for a number of years, now it's single-year ice, so it'll melt in the summer, it'll reform in the winter, and we are quite rapidly approaching the extent where we will see an ice-free Arctic Ocean for at least part of the summer season.
And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so don't go. Welcome back to From the South. The leader of Mali's ruling military junta, Colonel Assimi Goit, on Tuesday urged support for French and United Nations troops in the conflict-ridden Sahel State. Speaking to reporters during a ceremony marking Mali's 60 years of independence from France, Goit asked Malians to support national troops as well as partner forces from France and the UN peacekeepers. The presence of foreign troops in Mali has sometimes stoked controversy in the West African nation.
The message to the Malian people is a message of sacred union around Mali, and I ask them to support the armed forces of defense and security. This is the opportunity for me today to congratulate and encourage them for all their efforts to bring security and peace to Mali, and I also urge the Malian people to support our partner forces such as the Barkhane forces, MINUSMA and the Takuba force.
Colonel Assimi Goit also demanded an end to potentially crippling economic sanctions imposed after last month's coup in the impoverished Sahel State. Addressing reporters during the ceremony, Goit said the recent nomination of a civilian as interim president meant that the West African leaders must end their trade embargo. The 15-nation West African bloc, ECOWAS, shattered Mali's borders and imposed trade restrictions after Malian military officers ousted President Ibrahim Boubacar Keita on August 18th. This Tuesday, a strong explosion occurred around 3 p.m. in Beirut time in the town of Ain Kana in southern Lebanon, reported national media. The explosion took place in the area where the gas station is located. Several photographs and videos posted on social networks showed clouds of smoke at the scene of an incident. Reuters reported that several people were injured, although the exact figure is unknown at this time. The explosion comes 7 weeks after the massive explosion at Beirut port caused by the detonation of nearly 3,000 tons of improperly stored ammonium nitrate. On Tuesday, police used tear gas and water cannon to break up a protest by hundreds of people in Cameroon's economic capital, Douala, calling for an end to the bloodshed in the country's Anglophone regions. Several parties, including that of the opposition leader Maurice Kamto, had called for peaceful marches against President Paul Biya, who has ruled in the Central African country for nearly 40 years. The marchers called for a ceasefire and negotiations to end a long-running conflict between Anglophone separatists and security forces that has claimed more than 3,000 lives so far. The protesters also sought a reform to the electoral system. They converged at a major intersection in working-class districts of Douala, shouting slogans such as "Enough is enough" and "Paul Biya must go," before police dispersed them, making some arrests. India used the ultra-low crude oil prices earlier this year to top its strategic petroleum reserves, with oil at $19 a barrel, saving nearly $700 million in the process, India's Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas said on Monday. The average cost of which India bought the crude oil in April and May was $19 per barrel, compared to $60 a barrel oil price in January 2020. Thanks to the cheapest oil in years at the start of the second quarter, India saved $685 million on its crude oil import bill, the ministry said. India, like the world's largest oil importer, China took advantage of the lowest oil prices in decades in April to stock up on crude oil. As a result, India paid much less for the crude oil imported between April and July 2020 compared to the same period last year due to the significantly low prices and lower import volumes amid decreased fuel demand. And we have come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. Remember, you can also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Laura Palmeiro. Thank you for watching.